Down! Now! Alexei's voice tore through the chaos, sharp and urgent. He dove behind a jagged outcrop just as an explosion rocked the ground. The blast sent a shockwave rippling through the air, dust billowing and stinging his skin. His heart pounded in his chest, a war drum echoing in his ears. The alien landscape around him was stark. Vibrant, crystalline formations rose like jagged teeth from the ground, casting long, twisted shadows in the pale light of Proxima Centauri B's twin moons. A gust of wind howled across the rocky terrain, carrying the taste of iron and dust. The scent of something ancient, almost forgotten, clung to the air. "Report!" Alexei barked, his voice cutting through the haze of confusion. His hand gripped the rifle tighter, fingers tense, every nerve on edge. "Turrets are down," came Lieutenant Juno's response, her voice calm but clipped. She was already low, blending into the terrain with her camo suit. "But it's not over yet. We're walking straight into a hornet's nest." Alexei didn't need to ask for more details. He could feel the tension building in the air, thick as smoke. The ancient ruins ahead, where the sword was rumored to be, had just lit up with a surge of energy. Whatever that artifact was, it wasn't just an ancient relic. The stakes had just escalated, and they hadn't even set foot inside the ruins yet. His boots scraped against the rocky ground as he pushed forward. Each step felt heavier, more deliberate. The world around him buzzed with the sound of distant enemy patrols and the hiss of his team's breath in their comms. His senses were sharp, alert. The scent of alien vegetation filled his nostrils, something green and faintly sweet, a stark contrast to the dry, metallic tang of the air that followed their dropship. "Vikram," Alexei called, his voice low but firm. The urgency of the situation surged through him, but his mind stayed clear. There was no room for panic here. "Sir," came the crackling reply, "they're shifting positions. They're trying to box us in." Alexei's jaw tightened. "How long do we have before we're trapped?" "5 minutes," Vikram responded. "If we don't move fast, we'll be pincered from both sides. We need to take the sword, then get the hell out." Alexei glanced back at the men and women trailing behind him. They were seasoned soldiers, all with decades of combat experience, but the weight of this mission was different. This wasn't just about a fight. It was about what lay at the heart of this ruined alien world. The sword. He could already feel the pull of it, drawing him closer. His instincts screamed that this was no ordinary artifact. Every report, every piece of intel, said the same thing. It was something dangerous, something that could change the course of history. But there was so much they didn't know about it yet. He didn't let his mind wander. "Move out," Alexei ordered, voice steady. "We'll push through. Stay tight and keep your heads down." The sound of their boots against the rocky surface became the only noise around them as they moved in silence, tension hanging in the air like a thunderstorm. Their path led them toward the distant ruins, the stone remnants of a civilization older than anything humanity had encountered. As they neared the base of a towering crystal formation, the ground underfoot trembled slightly, sending vibrations up Alexei's legs. His fingers tightened around his rifle. Something was out there, something watching. The wind shifted, and Alexei caught a glimpse of it, far off, glowing faintly. There it was, the sword. It stood embedded in a block of black stone, its blade faintly pulsing with an inner light, almost alive. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, and his heart thudded in his chest. This was it, the source of all the mystery, the heart of everything they'd come for. Alexei hesitated for a moment, his fingers flexed, his body taut with anticipation. The sword's glow seemed to beckon him, its pulse steady and rhythmic, like the beat of a forgotten heart. A soft crackle came through his comms. "Alexei," Vikram's voice was tight, "I'm seeing things. It's not just a sword. Whatever's causing these energy readings, it's more than we thought." "I know," Alexei muttered under his breath. "We'll figure it out." Juno moved forward, her face hard with focus, her eyes fixed on the stone ahead. "Sir, I don't like this. Something's off." Alexei turned to her, his gaze sharp. "I'm not here for a sightseeing tour, Lieutenant. We're here to do a job. And we finish it. The distant rumble of an alien vehicle reached his ears, interrupting the moment. The enemy was closing in. "Get to the sword," Alexei commanded, voice low but filled with authority. He could feel it now, a crackling in the air like the charged silence before a storm. Every part of him, every instinct, screamed that something more was about to unfold. But he was ready. His team was ready. They moved quickly, weaving through the alien landscape, the crystal formations towering like jagged sentinels watching over them. The wind carried the sounds of alien voices, too distant to make out but close enough to send a shiver down their spines. As they reached the base of the stone block, the ground vibrated once more. It was stronger this time, a low, menacing thrum that seemed to reverberate through Alexei's bones. He looked up at the sword, its glow now brighter, its energy practically crackling in the air. "Ready," he said, barely above a whisper. The team gathered around him, weapons raised, eyes trained on the ancient stone. The battle they had prepared for was only just beginning. The mysteries of the sword and the dangers of this planet were about to be unleashed. Alexei's heart beat like a drum as he approached the sword, each step measured and deliberate. The glowing blade seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, an otherworldly hum in the air that set his teeth on edge. The crystal formations surrounding them glittered like shattered glass, catching the pale light of the moons above, casting fractured shadows that danced eerily across the ground. The wind picked up again, swirling sand and dust into the air, stinging his eyes and coating his lips with the dry taste of salt and ancient earth. "Eyes up," he muttered, his voice low, urgent. He didn't have to look back to know his team was behind him, moving with the same practiced caution, weapons at the ready. He could feel them, the tense energy of his soldiers matching his own, though each one had their own way of processing the danger. Vikram was scanning the horizon, fingers twitching near his holster. Juno's eyes darted around, taking in every shift in the environment. There was no room for complacency. As they neared the sword's base, the air seemed to thicken, a strange pressure building up in the space between them. The landscape ahead blurred at the edges, like the world was being drawn inwards, pulling them closer to something both familiar and entirely alien. Alexei's fingers flexed around his rifle, feeling the cold metal beneath his touch, grounding him in the moment. The sword stood there, embedded in the black stone, untouched and unyielding. The markings on its surface glowed faintly, strange symbols that seemed to move, shifting in ways Alexei couldn't quite comprehend. The sight of it sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just a relic. This was something else, something more. "Vikram," Alexei called out, not taking his eyes off the blade. "What do we have?" Alexei didn't need to be told twice. He knew exactly what was at stake. The sword was still just ahead, but with the enemy closing in, there was no time to waste. "Get to cover," Alexei ordered, his voice carrying the weight of urgency. The team scattered, finding cover behind the jagged cliffs and scattered crystal formations. The alien ships loomed overhead now, their sleek, unfamiliar designs cutting through the sky with terrifying precision. As Alexei huddled behind a large crystal outcrop, his eyes never left the sword. It was still there, waiting. But the longer they stayed, the more danger they invited. The strange, almost magnetic pull of the artifact seemed stronger now, like it was calling to him, urging him forward. "Move!" Alexei shouted, signaling for the team to advance. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward, through the haze of gunfire and explosions, toward the only thing that could give them the answers they needed. With every step, Alexei's resolve hardened. He couldn't explain it, but the sword was his key now. To what, he didn't know yet, but he couldn't back down. Not now. They reached the stone, the pulse of the sword reverberating in the air around them. Alexei could feel the energy swirling, a tangible force that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. He stepped forward, his hand brushing the hilt, and the world seemed to stop. The sword flared to life. The moment Alexei's fingers brushed the hilt, the world around him seemed to hold its breath. The air crackled, a strange electric pulse surging from the blade and spreading through his body like wildfire. He could feel it in his bones, vibrating through his fingertips, deep into his chest, each beat of the sword's energy syncing with his own heartbeat. His skin tingled, muscles tight with the strange force that was now coursing through him, electrifying the very air around him. The dust in the air, once still, began to swirl, as though the planet itself was reacting to the artifact's awakening. Juno's voice came through the comms, edged with disbelief. "Sir, are you touching it? What's happening?" Alexei didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, thoughts scrambling to make sense of the power that was surging from the sword, the pulse of energy that was becoming louder, almost deafening. It was a force that felt ancient, yet unsettlingly new, pulling him closer to something he could not fully comprehend. Behind him, Vikram's voice was low, but the edge of alarm was clear. "Sir, get away from it. This thing, it's not just a weapon, it's—" But before Vikram could finish, the sword erupted with a brilliant, blinding blue light, so intense that Alexei had to shield his eyes. For a moment, everything was drowned in that glow, a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes swirling around him. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the air around them pulsed with such force that it pushed them back, stumbling, as though the sword itself was alive, reacting to something deep within Alexei. The blast of energy slammed into his chest, and for a split second he thought he might be torn apart by the sheer magnitude of it. He gasped, the force of the power overwhelming, but the light began to fade, retreating into the sword's core. As the world around him snapped back into focus, Alexei realized his grip on the sword had tightened. His pulse was racing, not just from the physical strain of the energy, but from something else, an overwhelming sense of clarity, like the veil of uncertainty had lifted. "Alexei, are you all right?" Juno's voice cracked through the haze, raw with worry. He blinked, still reeling from the experience, and managed a shaky breath. "I'm fine. But this thing, this sword, it's not just a weapon. It's something more." He didn't have time to explain. The sudden realization of their danger snapped him back into focus. The enemy was close now, closing in from all sides, the ships from the canyon above beginning to drop lower, their shadows swallowing the ground as they descended toward them like hungry predators. "We've got company," Vikram's voice was sharp. "3 ships closing fast, and they're not alone." "Move!" Alexei barked, his voice slicing through the air with authority. "Get to cover. We can't hold them here." They scattered quickly, but as they did, Alexei could feel the sword's energy still swirling within him, like a living thing trying to communicate something he couldn't understand. It was as if it was waiting for him to make the next move. Juno sprinted to the left, keeping low to the ground. Vikram, always the sharp-eyed tactician, darted right, finding the high ground and scanning for any sign of the enemy. Alexei took a deep breath, then turned his gaze to the horizon, trying to make sense of the situation. He could hear the muffled sound of engines cutting through the wind, but there was something else, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to reverberate from the ruins themselves. The sword had done something, unleashed something they didn't yet fully understand. The sky overhead shifted, dark clouds rolling in like a blanket, suffocating the last vestiges of the moonlight. The once vibrant landscape now seemed muted, as though the energy from the sword had drawn the life from the planet. Or perhaps it had awakened something even older. The ground beneath their feet shifted again, a low rumble that Alexei felt in his bones. The terrain was unstable, and whatever ancient force had once shaped this planet was still present, waiting, dormant beneath the surface. But now it was stirring. "We're not alone," Juno said, her voice urgent as she crouched behind a massive crystalline rock formation. Her eyes scanned the skies, narrowed with focus. "There's something else. I can't see it, but I can feel it." Alexei's hand tightened around the sword's hilt, his mind racing. The energy in the air, the shifting of the earth beneath him, the presence of something unseen, it was all connected. His instincts were screaming at him to act, but he held back. They couldn't just rush in blindly. They needed to understand the full scope of the threat. "We're surrounded," Vikram said, his voice steady, though his eyes flicked nervously to the skies. "The ships are starting to circle. They've already marked our position." Alexei was about to speak when a deafening roar split the air, sending a shockwave through the ground. From behind the cliffs, the first of the enemy ships emerged, a sleek, dark silhouette cutting through the murky air. The weapon systems on board flashed, targeting systems locking in. "Take cover!" Alexei yelled. The sound of his command was drowned by the sudden barrage of laser fire. The air hissed with heat, and the ground exploded around them, sending rocks flying in all directions. They dove behind the nearest rock formations, the blasts narrowly missing them. Alexei's pulse raced as he tried to steady his breath. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was a full-scale engagement, and they were outnumbered. But they had no choice. They had to hold their ground and protect the sword. "Juno!" Alexei shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to move. Get to the high ground. Flank them. We'll cover you." "I'm on it," she replied, already shifting into motion, her form darting through the debris, finding a path to the higher cliffs. Alexei glanced over at Vikram, who was already lining up shots at the approaching ships. "Keep them distracted. I'll hold the line." Vikram gave him a sharp nod, his eyes cold and focused as he adjusted his aim. Alexei turned his attention back to the sword. The pulsing energy had not stopped. It was louder now, almost deafening. It wasn't just a tool. It was a beacon, calling them to something far greater. And they were walking straight into the heart of it. They had to survive this first, but Alexei couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. They weren't just fighting to stay alive. They were fighting to understand what the sword represented and why they had been drawn to it. Something in Alexei's gut told him that everything was about to change, and the answers were buried beneath this alien planet, hidden from all who dared seek them. He gripped the sword tighter, feeling its weight, its power. The storm was closing in, and they were standing at the eye of it. Alexei's eyes flicked between the horizon and the sword. Its pulse had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified, the energy radiating from it like an electric storm gathering in the distance. His pulse thrummed in time with the sword's steady, rhythmic beat. He could feel its presence deep within him, tugging, pulling, unnerving, yet strangely familiar. It wasn't just power. It was an invitation. "Juno, where are you?" Alexei's voice cut through the growing tension, his hand steadying the rifle slung across his chest. The air around him felt thicker, as though the planet itself had exhaled, heavy with the scent of old stone and something metallic, like rust or blood, clinging to the atmosphere. "I'm nearly there, sir. About 30 meters up." Juno's voice crackled through the comms, her words measured but her breath quick. "Just stay put. We're not alone." The distant roar of the enemy ships rumbled louder, their engines cutting through the wind, vibrating the very ground beneath Alexei's boots. He adjusted his stance, feeling the crunch of loose gravel beneath his feet as he crouched low, eyes narrowed on the darkening sky. Vikram, always the observer, kept scanning the air, his fingers twitching near his holster. "They're closing in fast," he muttered, barely audible. "They know what we're after." Alexei's eyes shifted to the swirling dust clouds forming in the distance. It wasn't just enemy ships now. The ground was shifting, too. Ripples of movement beneath the alien earth, as if something was awakening in response to the conflict above. He clenched his jaw, a chill creeping up his spine. "Take your shot when you see the opening, Vikram," Alexei said, voice low but clear. "We're not getting another chance." The first explosion tore through the air, deafening in its suddenness. A brilliant flash lit the landscape as an alien ship swooped low, its weapons charging. The ground beneath Alexei's feet trembled, and instinct took over. His rifle was already raised, sights locked onto the advancing ships. The air around them crackled with the searing sound of plasma fire, each blast a thunderous roar as it collided with the earth. The very air seemed to ripple, each explosion shaking the ground beneath them like a war drum. Alexei's heart raced, but his mind remained cool, sharp. He wasn't just reacting to the danger, he was calculating, analyzing. The sword's pull was stronger than ever, yet Alexei resisted. This was no time for impulsive decisions. Another ship dove down, its silhouette cutting through the cloud of dust and debris. Alexei's finger tightened around the trigger. A shot rang out, sending a blast of white-hot energy tearing through the sky. The ship's hull erupted in a cascade of sparks. But it didn't go down. The battle was far from over. "Juno now!" Alexei shouted, his voice carrying over the roar of the weapon's fire. He could feel the pressure building, the tightening of his chest, as the moment he had been dreading approached, the moment when their survival would depend on more than just firepower. The sound of Juno's voice came through the comms, sharp and focused. "Moving in! Cover me!" Before Alexei could respond, she was already in motion, darting between the large crystal formations, using the jagged rocks as cover. The ships above swarmed, circling, looking for an opening, their weapons firing in rapid succession. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and ionized dust, the acrid stench of weaponry clinging to every breath. Alexei's eyes never left the sky. The ships were coming in fast, the roar of their engines muffling the sound of his heartbeat. He knew their tactics. They would continue their assault until they had neutralized the threat, and right now they saw him and his team as that threat. There was no room for error. Juno's silhouette flashed against the rocky terrain, her movements swift and calculated. She was moving towards the high ground, a perfect vantage point for the next phase of the attack. Alexei could feel the wind shift again, carrying with it the faintest trace of something not quite right. The sword. The power it exuded wasn't just responding to him anymore. It was pulling at everything around him, resonating with the land, with the enemies above, and now, he suspected, with something buried deep beneath the planet's surface. He could feel it, a pressure building at the edges of his consciousness, tugging, coaxing. The sword wasn't simply a tool. It was a signal, a beacon. "Vikram, keep them distracted. I need a clear shot," Alexei ordered, his eyes still fixed on the sky, hands steady despite the rising chaos. A sharp crackle followed as Vikram fired, the report deafening, but the ship above evaded the blast. The fight was escalating, and Alexei could feel his grip on the sword tightening. It was as though the weapon was absorbing the battle itself, growing stronger with every move, every shot. From the corner of his eye he saw movement, a shadow darting between the rocks, his breath caught in his throat. Another enemy soldier, cloaked in a shimmering suit, slipped into view. Alexei raised his rifle, heart hammering in his chest. "Incoming! On the ground! 5 meters to your left!" Juno's voice was urgent, her warning coming too late. Alexei spun, just in time to see the soldier leap from behind a boulder, firing rapidly. The energy blast tore through the air, but Alexei was quicker, his rifle snapping to his shoulder. A burst of fire, and the soldier went down, his body crumpling into the dust, but the movement only made the others more aggressive. "Keep pushing forward," Alexei shouted, his words sharp, each one weighted with command. His team moved as one, responding to his orders without hesitation. They were good, seasoned. But this was unlike any battle they had faced before. There was something else here, something deeper. The energy in the air had shifted again. It was heavier now, pressing down, thick like smoke. The rocks around them vibrated as though they too were alive, responding to the unseen force beneath the surface. The sword was calling to him again. And then the ground trembled beneath them, harder this time. Alexei's legs buckled, his feet struggling to stay firm as the tremors rattled the very earth. It wasn't just a quake, it was deliberate. The planet itself seemed to be stirring, awakening from a long, deep slumber. "We need to move, now!" Alexei ordered, fear creeping into his voice for the first time since the battle began. But it was already too late. A sudden eruption of light exploded from the ground at their feet, sending rocks and debris flying in every direction. The force of the blast threw Alexei back, crashing into a massive shard of crystal. His vision blurred for a moment, his ears ringing from the explosion. When he finally regained his senses, the landscape had changed. The battlefield was now littered with wreckage and the scattered remnants of their assault. Juno's voice came through the comms again, breathless. What the hell just happened? Alexei didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the sword had done this, and whatever it was, they were only beginning to understand its power. The sword pulsed with an undeniable power, its energy thick in the air around Alexei. It thrummed like a heartbeat, steady, constant, but growing more insistent by the second. He could feel it deep within him, tugging at his instincts, calling him to something far greater than the fight he had just survived. The battle had ended in chaos, and yet Alexei's mind remained fixed on the sword. What had it just shown him? What was it preparing him for? The air felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. Each step Alexei took felt like it was drawing him closer to an unknown truth, one that had eluded him ever since they set foot on this cursed planet. He scanned the horizon, his eyes sharp despite the disorientation from the blast. The alien ships were gone, but the vibrations in the ground hadn't stopped. Whatever had just occurred, it wasn't a mere battle. It was something deeper, something ancient. Juno was the first to speak, her voice cutting through the static of their comms. "What the hell was that?" Her words came out tight, clipped with frustration and fear. She crouched beside him, eyes flicking between the sword and the horizon. "Sir, we're not alone." Alexei didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on the glowing blade. The sword's power seemed to pull him inward, drawing him like a magnet. It was calling, though Alexei couldn't fully understand what for. The earth beneath him seemed to hum in response, as if the planet itself was alive, breathing, aware. "I've never felt anything like this before," Vikram said, his voice tinged with awe. He stepped forward, his boots crunching softly in the rocky ground, but there was a hesitation in his movements. It wasn't fear, but something else, something that mirrored Alexei's own unease. "It's like it's watching us." Alexei finally tore his eyes from the sword and glanced at Vikram. "It's not just watching us. It's trying to show us something. We need to find out what." His words were firm, but beneath the surface, there was a growing realization. They had crossed a line, and they weren't just dealing with an alien artifact anymore. This was far beyond that. Juno adjusted her weapon, her body tense. "We're out of time. Whatever this is, it's not going to stay hidden for long. The other factions, the ones we've been fighting, they'll be back, and they'll be bringing more." Alexei's grip tightened on the sword's hilt. "Then we make sure they don't get it." The distant rumble in the air had only gotten louder. It wasn't the sound of engines this time, it was something else. The ground beneath them shifted again, but this time it felt more deliberate. It was as if the planet itself was responding to the sword, reacting to its power. Something was coming, something beyond the ships in the sky. "We're not prepared for this," Juno muttered, eyes scanning the barren landscape. "This isn't just a fight we can win with bullets and strategy. Whatever's below, it's bigger than anything we've seen." Alexei turned his gaze back to the sword. The light from the blade flickered and pulsed, casting strange, shifting shadows across the landscape. It was as if the sword was revealing something beneath the surface, something ancient and buried deep within the planet's core. He stepped forward, the ground crunching under his boots, and for a moment he swore he felt the sword hum in response. It felt almost alive, as if it were reaching out to him, calling him to action. He had no idea what it wanted, but his gut told him that this was it, the moment they had been waiting for. "Vikram, Juno," Alexei began, his voice low but steady. "We've been fighting the wrong war. This is bigger than what we've been told. The sword is just the beginning." "What do you mean, sir?" Vikram's voice was sharp, questioning, but there was a hint of disbelief. "We've just taken down an entire battalion's worth of enemies. What else could be out there?" Alexei's eyes never left the sword. "There's a hidden history here, something buried beneath all this, under this planet, under the wars. This sword? It's not a weapon. It's a key." The ground trembled again, harder this time, and a deep, resonant sound echoed from the earth. A wave of energy shot from the sword, rippling through the air, visible only by the slight distortion in the atmosphere. It sent a shiver down Alexei's spine. He turned sharply, but before he could say another word, a shadow moved in the distance. Something large, massive even, loomed at the edge of the rocky terrain, shifting, moving with unnatural grace. It wasn't just the enemy approaching. It was something else, something old. "Juno, Vikram, take cover," Alexei shouted, but his voice barely registered over the deafening sound that began to rise from the depths of the planet. The air became thick with pressure, and the ground beneath them began to crack, large fissures appearing in the earth, as if something was pushing upward. Vikram raised his rifle, eyes scanning, but his voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "What the hell is that?" Alexei's gaze narrowed as he saw the form emerging from the rift, huge, shadowed, and silent. The air around it seemed to warp and distort, as though reality itself was bending in its presence. It was no ship, no soldier. It was something older and far more dangerous. The creature, if that was even what it was covered in dark stone-like armor that shimmered faintly with energy. The surface of its body seemed to pulse with an eerie, unnatural light, flickering like a dying star. Alexei could feel the temperature drop around them, a chill crawling up his spine, his breath turning visible in the air. "We need to move," Juno said, her voice tight with fear. "That thing's coming for us." "Not yet," Alexei said, his words sharp, holding them both in place. His mind raced. This wasn't an attack, it was something else. This creature, this force wasn't here to fight. It was here to test them. Suddenly, the air became thick with static, the same energy from the sword now filling the space between them. Alexei could feel it pulsing, like a countdown, pushing him forward, toward the thing that had just emerged from the depths of the planet. The creature began to move, slowly at first, but its pace quickened, the ground shaking beneath its weight. "Get ready," Alexei muttered under his breath, his body tense, waiting for the inevitable. His hand tightened on the sword, feeling the pulse beneath his fingers, knowing that this moment would define everything. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it, and as the ground cracked open completely, the creature leaping forward, the first real battle between humanity and the secrets buried beneath the earth began. The ground trembled violently, cracks running across the barren surface like veins of a dying creature. Alexei's grip tightened around the sword's hilt, the metal searing against his palm. The creature, if it could even be called that, loomed before them, its massive form nearly blocking the sky as it advanced. The weight of the air itself seemed to shift, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on their chests, making every breath feel like it could be their last. The energy around the sword intensified, vibrating in time with the movement of the creature. Alexei's senses were overloaded. He could feel the warmth of the air against his skin, thick with the scent of dust and something older, something primal. Beneath the surface of the planet, something was waking up, a force beyond anything he had ever encountered. "Don't let it touch you." Juno's voice came through the comms, low and tense. She was crouched beside him, her weapon raised, eyes scanning the alien creature that seemed to materialize from the very earth. "Whatever this is, it's not just a threat. It's part of something bigger." Alexei's eyes never left the creature. The pulsating light from the sword reflected off its body, casting jagged, shifting shadows in every direction. The creature's skin was like black stone, rough and scarred, but it moved with unnatural grace, its eyes glowing faintly, an eerie, predatory yellow. Its presence was suffocating, as if it had been waiting for them, watching them since the moment they arrived on this cursed planet. The sword in Alexei's hands pulsed again, its glow now steady, casting an unearthly light across the alien landscape. His muscles tightened, instinct urging him to fight, but his mind screamed to wait. There was something wrong. The sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a key, a guide to something buried beneath the surface. He could feel it calling to him, urging him to step forward. "We can't wait any longer." Vikram's voice broke through his thoughts, snapping him back to reality. "It's coming for us." The creature's massive footfalls shook the ground with each step, the vibrations reverberating through Alexei's bones. He felt the pull of the sword once more, its call growing louder in his ears, more insistent. It was almost as if the creature itself was drawn to the weapon, its movements synchronized with the energy pouring from the blade. "On my mark," Alexei said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. He knew the creature wasn't just a beast. It was a guardian, a sentinel, and it had been waiting for centuries to awaken. Whatever had caused its slumber to end, it had chosen them. They were part of a much larger story now, one that was far beyond the war they had been fighting. The creature let out a low growl, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth, each one gleaming in the dim light. The ground beneath Alexei's feet vibrated with each movement, sending loose stones rolling across the cracked earth. He could taste the dust in the air, a thick, dry taste that coated the inside of his mouth. He swallowed it down, forcing his focus to sharpen. He couldn't afford distractions. "We need to move," Juno said again, this time more urgently. She was already on her feet, moving silently, almost instinctively, toward the high ground. She knew what Alexei was about to do. He had to act fast. The sword was the key, but it wouldn't be enough to face this creature without the right strategy. Alexei stepped forward, the weight of the sword in his hands growing heavier with each step. It wasn't just the physical burden, it was the emotional weight, the sense that this moment had been years, centuries in the making. He could feel the pulse of the blade sinking with his heartbeat, the energy growing stronger as he moved closer to the creature. Every fiber of his being screamed for action, but his mind remained calm, focused. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for answers. As he closed the distance, the creature's eyes locked onto him, its gaze cold, calculating. It moved slowly at first, but its speed picked up, its massive limbs pushing through the dust and debris. Alexei could feel the air thickening, suffocating with the weight of what was happening. The sword pulsed in his hands, guiding him forward, pulling him toward the heart of the conflict. When he was within striking distance, Alexei's body reacted before his mind could fully process. He swung the sword, the blade cutting through the air with a sharp slicing motion. But as it connected with the creature's stone-like skin, it made no sound. The sword didn't slice through its body, as Alexei had expected. Instead, the energy from the blade shot through the creature's form, sending a shockwave of force through the ground beneath them. The creature recoiled, its eyes flashing with something like surprise. The ground shook harder, and the air crackled with a sharp static charge. The sword was responding, its power unleashing in ways Alexei couldn't understand. The light from the blade intensified, blinding him for a moment, but it was different now. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a conduit, a force of nature calling forth something deeper. "Alexei, what's happening?" Juno's voice was a whisper in the chaos, full of disbelief. "I don't know," Alexei replied, his voice strained. He could feel the sword pulsing with raw energy, too strong, too powerful to control. "But I think we've just woken something far worse than we ever imagined." The creature was no longer retreating. It was preparing for something more. Its body rippled, the stone-like skin shifting and reshaping, and Alexei realized in that moment that they weren't fighting a physical being. This wasn't just a guardian. It was an entity, a remnant of something older, something that existed before them, before the war, before even the sword. The energy from the sword flared again, brighter, hotter. Alexei staggered back, feeling a rush of dizziness, but he refused to let go. The creature's eyes blazed, its body convulsing as if reacting to the sword's power. Then suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, splitting wide with a deafening roar. The earth seemed to tear itself apart, pulling Alexei and his team into a deeper, darker abyss. The sword's pulse grew louder, more chaotic, until Alexei thought he might be torn apart by the sheer force of it. "Get out!" Vikram shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the earth splitting open. Juno moved first, pulling Alexei toward the cliffside, but the ground beneath them was buckling, crumbling away. The air grew colder, and the earth groaned, its ancient power resonating through the very ground they stood on. And as the abyss swallowed them whole, Alexei couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The creature wasn't just a guardian, it was a harbinger. Something worse was waiting, and they were about to find out what. The ground split open with a deep, resonating crack, sending shock waves of dust and debris into the air. Alexei barely registered the sensation of falling before he slammed into something solid, his ribs protesting against the impact. The air around him was thick with the scent of burning rock and something metallic, like the earth itself was cracking open to reveal what had been buried for millennia. His pulse hammered in his ears, and the chaos of the battlefield seemed miles away. All that existed now was the darkness surrounding him, and the pulsing energy of the sword in his hand. "Alexei, move!" Juno's voice broke through the disorienting fog, her words sharp with urgency. He looked up, barely able to make out her silhouette through the thick dust swirling in the air. The hole they had fallen into wasn't just deep. It was a chasm that seemed to go on forever, its sides slick with centuries of forgotten moisture. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to push himself up, the weight of the sword almost dragging him back to the ground. "Get up! Now!" Vikram shouted, his voice barely audible over the grinding of the rocks shifting around them. Alexei pushed himself to his feet, his head spinning from the fall. He wiped the sweat from his brow, ignoring the gritty feel of the dust that clung to his skin. His fingers tightened around the hilt of the sword. The blade pulsed again, its energy lapping at his skin, almost like it was alive. A part of him wanted to drop it, to run, to escape. But he knew it was their only hope, the key to whatever was buried down here. The air was dense with the smell of crushed stone and decay, the scent of ancient forces awakening. His eyes were adjusting to the dim light, flickering as his senses sharpened in the low, oppressive atmosphere. "Look around," Alexei said, his voice low but steady. The words felt foreign in the silence. The team didn't respond immediately, but Alexei knew they were already scanning the environment, searching for any signs of movement, of threat. Juno's voice came through the comms again, her tone more measured now, though still thick with tension. "We're deep under the surface, sir. If we go further, there's no telling what we'll find." Alexei took a slow breath, his hand still gripping the sword. "I know, but we don't have a choice. This is where it all leads. This thing, whatever it is, it's the key. If we can find out what it wants, what it's guarding, maybe we can understand how to fight it, or how to stop it." Juno didn't respond at first, but there was a long, drawn-out breath on the other end of the comms. "You really think we can control it?" "I don't think we have any other options," Alexei replied. He turned his head to look at Vikram, who was already picking his way through the darkness, his eyes focused on the distant glow of what looked like an entrance further down the cavern. "Can you read the layout, Vikram? Can you make sense of it?" Vikram crouched beside the glowing light, his fingers brushing the surface of the strange glowing stone walls. "It's a tunnel, like an ancient underground city, but these markings are different, alien." "Then we move," Alexei said, already stepping forward, the weight of the sword pulling him toward whatever lay ahead. "Stay sharp. This place is more than a tomb. It's a fortress." The deeper they moved into the abyss, the thicker the air became, each breath harder to take. The walls of the cavern were slick with moss and ancient minerals, the strange symbols etched deep into the stone, glowing faintly under their feet. The sense of something ancient, something alive, was unmistakable now. It was as if the entire cavern was breathing, shifting with the energy of long-forgotten histories. Alexei could hear the faint echo of his team's footsteps, muffled by the oppressive weight of the underground world. The sword in his hands pulsed again, almost like it was calling out. Every fiber of his being vibrated in time with the rhythm of the blade. The deeper they went, the more connected he felt to the planet, to the weapon, and to whatever it was guarding down here. "Everyone stay close," Alexei ordered. "We don't know what's ahead." They pressed forward, moving through narrow passageways and cavernous rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. The air was thick with the musty scent of decay, of something ancient that had long been hidden beneath the surface. It felt as though they were trespassing in a place meant to be forgotten. But the sword, it had chosen them. They had no choice but to follow where it led. As they moved deeper into the structure, the air began to change. It wasn't just stale and cold anymore. It was charged with energy, a static hum that filled the cavern. Alexei's heart raced. The sword had reached its peak again, its power flooding the room in waves. Something was coming. Something was about to be revealed. "Stop!" Alexei said suddenly, his hand raised in caution. Vikram froze immediately, his eyes scanning the walls. The glowing symbols had become more intense now, almost pulsing in rhythm with the sword. It was as though they were leading them toward a focal point, a destination. And then the ground shifted again. This time, it wasn't a tremor. It was the earth moving beneath their feet, a rumbling that came from deep within the planet's core. The walls of the cavern cracked open, and Alexei stepped back instinctively, his rifle raised. A low, resonant growl vibrated through the air. It was deep, guttural, coming from somewhere within the depths of the cavern. The sound reverberated through the walls, as if the very stone was alive. The creature, the ancient force that had been awakened, was responding. "We need to move! Now!" Juno shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. Alexei hesitated for only a second before he grabbed the sword with both hands, stepping forward into the growing darkness. They weren't just running anymore. They were chasing something. They were seeking answers, but the more they moved forward, the clearer it became that the answers were coming to them. They weren't ready for what they would find, but they had no choice. The sword was their guide, and it was leading them to the heart of this mystery. With each step, the air grew colder, the sound of their breathing louder in their ears. And then, as they rounded the final bend, they saw it, a massive chamber stretching out before them, vast and filled with shifting crystalline formations. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and upon it lay an object, an orb, glowing with the same eerie, otherworldly light that radiated from the sword. But as Alexei approached, he realized with a growing sense of dread that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much larger. The orb wasn't just a relic. It was the heart of the planet, the source of the power that had been awakening beneath their feet. And it was waiting for them. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. Alexei stepped forward, the sword in his hands glowing with an intensity that seemed to match the weight of the cavernous room. The orb at the center of the pedestal pulsed in time with the rhythm of his heart, its eerie light reflecting off the jagged walls. The air around them was thick with the scent of ancient stone and the faintest trace of something metallic. His breath felt shallow, each exhale a reminder that whatever had been buried beneath the surface was now awakening, something far greater than they could have anticipated. Behind him, he could hear his team moving, their steps slow but deliberate, each of them caught in the same trance-like pull that the sword had on him. Juno's voice came through the comms, low and steady, but edged with tension. "Alexei, we're not alone. The presence here, it's more than just the sword." He didn't need to turn around to know that she was right. He could feel it, a force pressing in from all sides, a weight in the very air itself. The orb at the center of the chamber was no longer just a beacon. It was a presence, alive with power, older than anything they had ever encountered. The sword in his hand seemed to hum, as if it recognized the orb, as if they were two halves of the same whole. The floor beneath them trembled again, not with the force of an explosion, but with something far more primal, a deep, resonant vibration that echoed through their bones. The walls of the chamber shifted, a low grinding sound accompanying the movement of massive stone slabs. They were trapped. The way out was closing. "We need to move," Vikram said, his voice calm but urgent. "There's no time." But Alexei didn't move. His eyes were locked on the orb, and for a moment the world seemed to fade away. The sword pulsed again, stronger now, the light from its blade casting long shadows across the room. He could feel it in his chest, a surge of power that filled every inch of him, leaving no room for doubt. This was why they had come here. This was the moment that would define everything they had fought for. "Alexei," Juno called again, her voice closer this time. "We're out of time. That thing, whatever it is, it's not waiting for us." He could hear the urgency in her tone, but it wasn't just fear. It was the same realization that had taken root inside him. The orb wasn't waiting for them to make a move. It had been waiting for them. The sword, the orb, the planet itself, it had all led them here, to this very moment. They weren't the invaders. They were the chosen. He stepped forward again, each movement deliberate, the air growing colder with each step. His boots crunched against the stone floor, a sharp contrast to the low thrum that filled the air. The sword hummed in his hands, louder now, as if it was speaking to him, guiding him. "There's no turning back now," Alexei whispered, his voice almost lost in the silence. His eyes were fixed on the orb, and for the first time he understood its purpose. It wasn't just a relic. It was a test, a trial, meant for the ones who would truly understand the responsibility that came with its power. Alexei raised the sword above his head, its light growing brighter, almost blinding, as the air around him seemed to bend with the force of its energy. The orb responded, its glow intensifying, the room vibrating with a resonance that threatened to tear the very fabric of reality apart. The walls trembled as the ancient power contained within the orb reached its peak. "Do it," Juno urged, her voice steady now, but full of the same unspoken understanding. She had seen it too. They had come here to reclaim what was theirs, to take back the power that had once belonged to humanity, not to conquer, but to protect. With a final breath, Alexei swung the sword downward, the energy of the blade connecting with the orb. The impact sent a shockwave of force through the room, knocking them all to their knees. The light from the sword and the orb fused together, a blinding wave that engulfed the entire chamber. The ground shook violently, the air growing thick with energy as the room trembled, as if the planet itself was reacting to their actions. But then, in the silence that followed, something incredible happened. The vibrations ceased, the dust settled, and Alexei opened his eyes to see the orb suspended in midair, its glow now calm, steady. The sword pulsed one last time, its energy beginning to recede into the blade. The air felt lighter, as if the weight of centuries had been lifted. They had done it. But it wasn't just the sword. It was the belief. The understanding that humanity's true power wasn't in destruction, but in the capacity to protect, to love, to unite. "We've done it," Vikram said, his voice a low murmur, disbelief hanging in the air. "We've awakened it." "No," Alexei corrected, his voice steady, filled with a quiet strength. "We've earned it." They stood there, bathed in the gentle light of the orb, as the echoes of the past reverberated through their minds. The sword had chosen them. Humanity had proven that it could rise above the struggles of the past and face the future with honor, with unity. They had unlocked the true potential of their species, not through force, but through understanding, through connection. Juno stepped forward, her eyes meeting Alexei's. "What now?" Alexei looked at the orb, the sword still in his hands. It had led them to this moment, to this understanding, but it wasn't over. Not yet. There were more battles to fight, more challenges to face, but now they knew what they were fighting for. "We move forward," Alexei said, his voice unwavering. "Together." As the light from the orb bathed them in its warmth, they knew they were not just survivors. They were the guardians of something much greater than themselves. The future of humanity was no longer uncertain. They had proven their worth, and the galaxy would never forget what they had done.